Welcome, everyone, and thank you very much for joining the Gene Drive Forum series of panel discussions for considering the case of gene drive technologies through social science theories on stakeholder engagement. It is really great to see that we have individuals from around the globe participating today. And to those of you who stayed up very late or got up very early to join, I thank you very much. I'm Karen Tudis. I'm from the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health's Gene Convene Global Collaborative, and this series is co-hosted through the forum by Gene Convene and by the Genetic Biocontrol of Invasive Rodents Partnership, also known as the GBIRD Partnership. This session is titled Stakeholder Engagement and Controversy, Lessons from the Ground. It is the first of 5 in this series. My colleague Royden Saw from the GBIRD Partnership and I were very pleased that Dr. Jim Lavery from Emory University kindly accepted our invitation to moderate the panel discussion today. So thank you so much, Jim. And I think with no further ado, I will hand the virtual floor over to you to introduce the panelists and begin the discussion.
Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Royden. Really pleased to join this morning from Atlanta, Georgia, and really pleased to have just an outstanding panel here. Just a couple of framing points for me before we get underway. We're going to post the bios of the panelists in the chat so that you can have a look at those at your leisure. As is the case often in these events, the bios would take the entire time to go through. We have a really accomplished bunch of panelists this morning. I'm going to take a minute, literally, just to tell you who the panelists are, and then we're going to just get underway. So I want to welcome Guilherme Costa, who's joining us this morning from Brasilia in Brazil. Guilherme is the leads communications at the World Mosquito program and has an extensive experience both as a professor and as a practitioner in communications related to climate change, public engagement, and a wide range of issues. Next is Jason Delborne. Jason is joining us this morning from the great state of North Carolina here in the United States. Jason's a professor of science, policy, and society at North Carolina State University, and for anyone involved in this space whatsoever, a very well-known and very well-respected expert in this area. So Jason, real pleasure to have you this morning. And probably the most exciting introduction I think this morning goes to Patricia. So Patricia Leon is joining us this morning from the Galapagos Islands, and she leads the program designed for island conservation for the Latin America office. And in the Galapagos, she's also been an advisor to the President's Council in the Galapagos, and an advisor to many other major entities around the world. So Patricia, really grateful to have you here this morning as well. And finally, I'd just like to welcome an old friend, Leah Paratoe, who's joining us this morning from Bobo Dioulasso in Burkina Faso in West Africa. Leah is a social scientist and anthropologist at the Institut de Recherche en Sciences de la Santé in Bobo Dioulasso. And she has really been a sort of central figure in leading the stakeholder engagement activities for target malaria and thinking these issues through in a very deep way. So I'm really just super grateful that you've all agreed to join us this morning. And a couple of other framing points. One, even though this is a gene drive consortium in a sense, that we're really looking broadly to draw insights from a number of different contexts. So it's not all gene drive focused, but the lessons I think will be very applicable. And the final framing point is that we focused on this idea of controversy, not to be controversial, but to sort of try to get to the points where some of these conversations have the most salience and where we think we have a lot of work to do to really work through them. And Leah, I want to open up. I want to turn to you. In an earlier conversation, we were talking about some of the challenges for people like our panelists in internal conversations in programs, the role of social scientists, the role of engagement leads in kind of navigating that place within a program and leading those conversations and participating in them. So I wonder if you could start us off, Leah, with some thoughts about that issue from your perspective.
Thank you very much, Jim. It is a pleasure for me to be part of this conversation. And I want to talk about these challenges or this controversy at internal level of the team. Most of the time, the engagement, the stakeholder engagement is led by social scientists. And we are working with the natural scientists. And in terms of the collaboration, we can have some challenges. Because when you talk about the science in general, scientists don't talk too much about what they are doing. They prefer work on the lab or in the field. At the hand, they have the finding. They can propose this finding to the stakeholders by saying, okay, you have this issue, and now we have the finding to tackle this issue. But when you are talking about the engagement, you are talking about sharing information. You are talking about providing the detail on the science. And the stakeholder, the engagement should be started at the early stage of the process of the research. So when you start to communicate with the stakeholders, you will give them the detail on what you are doing in the lab. And this gives the opportunity to the stakeholder to ask a lot of questions. And they can have some requests about this research. And all of those interactions can slow down the research, the process. And the scientists, that is not easy for the scientists to stop their work and provide the detail, or also to give some explanation on the uncertainty. Let me give you an example. In target malaria, when we are working on the field, because of the stakeholder engagement is one of the strong pieces of this research, we want to take time with the stakeholder to give them the detail on the process of the research in order they can they can have time and have the good level of understanding to give their informed consent on the different activities. I want to give a specific example of the one entomological activities, for instance, is the release of the mosquitoes. It could be just the white-cap mosquitoes. It's not the genetically modified mosquitoes. But sometimes they release those mosquitoes and then they recapture and to analyze the different species of mosquitoes. The engagement team need time to explain this on the stakeholders. And sometimes the stakeholders take time to understand. And the consequences is the delay on the timing for the entomological team. And that bring some controversy because they want to go fast, but because we need to take time to explain to the stakeholders, that could be create some challenges. And another thing that I want to share with about these challenges between when you talk about the engagement, it's come from the stakeholder itself. As I said previously, usually the researchers don't communicate a lot on what they are doing. Because people are used on this way to conduct the research, when you add the engagement pieces and you go to the community and start to communicate on the process, not on the finding of the research, the stakeholder sometimes don't understand this new way to work, to do the research. And they have the question as like this: why do we explain us the process of the research? It is the first time. There is any problem with the research? Are you confident? And what are your expectations? I want to highlight the fact that the engagement sometimes it's not easy for the stakeholder to understand why we do the engagement also on the research.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you also set up so nicely, Leah, that not only is it difficult for them to understand and really grasp the context, but when you have this kind of tension with the, let's call it the impatience of scientists, which is how we make advances, but it can create those kind of those tensions. And Leah, let me flip to Jason. Jason, you've obviously thought a lot about these issues. You jump in here and add some thoughts.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I'd like to build on what Leah described and sort of pull back even one step further, which is sort of controversies or different understandings of why we do engagement at all. So one of my experiences in working with multidisciplinary teams is that, sometimes I work with scientists who are very eager to communicate, and they understand that they're working on a controversial technology and that there is a kind of risk of opposition from community or stakeholder groups. And so they really want to communicate. And so they want to engage social science to figure out how to do that. And the question then is, to what purpose? And oftentimes, technical experts think of engagement as a strategy of persuasion, that this is a means of gaining consent from a community or group of stakeholders with a plan that's already formed, a technology that's already made, and we simply want permission to go forward, which is a more respectful and thoughtful way to approach your research than just running roughshod over a community. But my perspective as an engagement practitioner is something a step back from that, which is to engage the community in the design and testing of a technology, so that there's an interaction between experts and other stakeholders and communities. And that's actually a difficult thing for both stakeholders and scientists to understand, how that kind of interaction can be productive and useful when sometimes they're not used to any communication at all. And the communication that they are used to is usually of a persuasive character.
Right, and that, I think that so nicely, brings into sharper relief the point that Leah was making too, about essentially being stuck in this tension of, trying to be respectful and gracious and doing those things appropriately, but just not having the fully worked out context for people. I want to go to Guilherme in a minute to come back to, because I think some of the issues around mosquitoes are actually really fascinating and common. But Guilherme, before I come to you, I want to go to Patricia, because Patricia, in one of the earlier conversations we were having too, I think one of the issues that Leah raised and that Jason alluded to is this idea of, what kind of expectations or what kind of understanding people have about why you're even engaging in the first place. And I think in the context that you work in conservation, you know, you've told us about some of those kind of cultural dimensions where some of the ways that you're trying to approach these problems may not be a really good fit. And it seems like that's another aspect of the tension.
Yes, thanks, Jim. We've been working in different cultural scenarios, right? And one of them, our work at Island Conservation, is removing rodents and other invasive animals from islands to prevent extinctions. And in the different islands where we work, we find that some of the animals that we think from an environmentalist perspective need to be removed from these islands are used by locals for their cultural practices. So, for example, goats in Juan Fernandez Island off the coast of Chile. People hunt these goats. They were put there hundreds of years ago by whalers and pirates, you know, who wanted to have a fresh source of meat when they went through these islands. And people who currently live there hunt them as part of their kind of bonding among each other, and it's something they do to bond. So when we proposed let's take all of them out, they weren't quite happy because they wanted to continue basically hunting them once in a while. And so we engaged in a conversation that took several months really to understand why this was and how we could approach this in kind of find a happy medium. And so it was difficult because our perspective was, you know, they're bad for the environment. These goats are not from here. They've been introduced. They're really taking all the food and seedlings and everything that the birds that are from these islands and are on the verge of extinction need to survive. So we really need to take them out. And if you really like these islands, you need to be able to do this work, right? Let us do this work. But we were able to find what we ended up having a facilitated dialogue process. So we brought someone, an external third party, basically, who helped us sit down with the community and find ways to be able to do the eradication, but also allow them to keep doing their cultural practices. So what we ended up agreeing with the community was to fence off a small portion of the island where the goats could remain, and the vast majority of the island would be cleared from goats. But in this process, we also realized that the true interests were not only I want to hunt goats. Yeah, there were other issues in the position. So I think one of the big lessons learned is that if you focus on the interests behind the positions themselves, you're able to offer alternatives that address the different interests of the community. And many times these interests are varied, they're wide. And so we ended up training some of the community members to help us in the eradication efforts. So if they're trained hunters, for example, they could help us in some parts of our eradication efforts and thus generate some work locally. We ended up also engaging women in different ways to process different parts of the eradication. So through this process of engagement, where we were actually opening up our original plan and finding ways to basically change our original plan to incorporate the interests of the community, we were able to identify different interests and include in our project design aspects that were easy for us to do and that were very valuable for the other group. And that ended up being a very good experience, I think, for us and for the community. And then we also think they now are happy to help us take care of the results, right? Because once you've eliminated the animals, you need the community to participate in making sure those animals don't come back. So that's very, that was an example of how you can take different interests into consideration.
So
incorporate them into program design.
Yeah, and Patricia, it's a terrific example on a number of levels. And in our work, we talk about the importance of what we call non-obvious interests. And what I really like is the looking at approaches to kind of dig deeper in what lies, as you said, what lies behind people's positions. And before handing it over to Guilherme, I think another point that I think is really important to focus on here is that we tend to think about controversy in kind of very grand terms. You know, when people are fighting or when there's real conflict, or and I think your point is a more subtle one about how we need to conceptualize the idea even of controversy. And it may be that what you're showing us is that controversy can arise if you don't have a good understanding of those different interpretations of what interests might be in play, and they may grow if they're not dealt with very well. So I thought that was just really useful. So Guilherme, over to you to lots of points of connection from your work here. So please.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. So I was just thinking about what my colleagues was saying and reflecting about our reality here in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And I was thinking about something that it's a different kind of knowledge that we have in place. So we have the inside the scientists, among them or among us, social science or natural science, we have different understandings of the territory that we are working, but also have the knowledge that is coming from the community. I have an example working in Rio and working in a very vulnerable, economic and social vulnerable areas inside the favelas. We have different rules. We have different understandings of the life, the daily life, the routine of the community. And we have also situations, in some kinds of situations that even the government cannot come inside the favelas. So if you just understand that the science is the science and knows everything, or us social science are understanding the territory, probably will not work when we are working in a difficult situation like that because this dialogue that Patricia was saying it comes from the understanding that everybody has a deep understanding of their own daily life and daily routine and what they are working with. So in our cases that we are working with Wolbachia mosquitoes, it's not just explaining the change, the behavioral change, and also the mindset of dengue control in the country, because we have a lot of years saying to kill mosquitoes, and now we're saying yes, you will keep your community will keep killing the mosquitoes, but we will start releasing mosquitoes. It's not just that that it's a point of controversy per se, but also this understanding of how is the territory, the way the territory works. So if we try to make this connection between the community or the community knowledge to the community, the scientific knowledge, and find the right language to that, probably will be more, it's more likely to have a real dialogue happening.
Yeah. And the, I mean, it's a great point on a couple of points. I want to pick up a couple of threads, but also I think it also highlights, Guilherme, just how fundamentally important relationships are. I think we tend to gloss over the concept of relationship because it sounds a little soft and social science-y. But of course, we actually know, and we know certain from every industry in the world, that relationships are what really drives success virtually in every context. And I think that, figuring out how to privilege relationships, how to build the right kind of context for, funding them, enabling them so that they can sort of do that authentic work, I think is really important. I mean, the other thing I wanted to just pick up on that I thought was a nice addition to what we've heard so far too, Guilherme, is this idea that, you know, we tend to sometimes view a new context for work as a kind of blank slate. And of course, it's anything but a blank slate. As Patricia talked about, and you know, in our work, we talk about the sort of landscape of interests. You know, who are these stakeholders? What kind of interests are already very much alive, and what kind of factors in those contexts are maybe making some sorts of controversy more likely, and whether or not we're aware of those things. So Leah, I want to come back to you because and you know, I've had the good fortune of visiting you in Bobo Dioulasso and being out in the field with you, and you know, you're working in a very complex context as well. So I wonder if we could pick up on the point that you started off with about the difficulty of trying to not just communicate facts and communicate information, but to try to have people understand, you know, back to Jason's point, the purpose. What is it that you're really trying to accomplish? And maybe tell us a bit about how you've approached that problem in your work. How do you get to addressing that in a way that's constructive?
You know, Target Malaria working on the gene drive. The final aim is the gene drive, but now we start with the genetically modified mosquitoes without gene drive. And one of the challenges is how to explain this so complex scientific world to the community. But I can say from our experiences, community can understand the science, and they can also understand the uncertainty. We work with the community to co-develop the glossary to explain what is the gene, what is the chromosome, the DNA, to explain these genetically modified mosquitoes. And based on their knowledge, we make the translation. It's not the word translation. We don't translate the gene in the local language, but we translate the concept. When you talk about the gene, what is this reality in the local language, in the community experiences? And from there, they come with the different word to fix this concept. And that was a great example of collaboration between the scientists and the community. And at the end, we can say that the community can understand the science. We need to find the best way. We need to have time to talk with them.
Yeah, and Leah, that, you know, it picks up, I think, so nicely on a point that Patricia made. You know, again, thinking about how to actually address these issues through various engagement strategies, and this idea of facilitated dialogue, you know, different approaches where we really sort out through well-designed processes how to listen to stakeholders, how to really hear them. And I love the idea about this kind of co-produced glossary as a way of just sorting out, you know, some of the starting language even about what, you know, what we're talking about, how to frame it in ways that are kind of both culturally appropriate and make sense. And Jason, I want to come to you with, because I'm trying to get my mind around the, like a taxonomy of controversy, because so many of these things look very subtle. They don't feel like people storming the Capitol, which is a current controversy here in the United States. They feel much more subtle and nuanced. So I know you thought a lot about that. Could you just give us some thoughts about the idea of controversy that we're trying to focus on here today?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a very broad, difficult question to figure out the landscape. But we've already talked some about thinking through different kinds of interests. So that's, I think, part of the landscape to understand. And Patricia's example of the goat eradication was an excellent example where there was a way to find compromise. That's a perfect example of a way to find compromise where each side is giving up a little bit because they better understand the interests of what could have been an explosive fight. And there are stories in the Galapagos about major controversies between conservationists and local people. So, the fact that Patricia's group was able to navigate that is actually a major success and not a trivial detail. I think, something that underlies this landscape of controversy also is what are the kind of expectations of what do people need to know to be able to engage responsibly? And this came up in what Leah was describing in terms of the glossary. This is a really subtle point. How much science do people need to know to engage in discussions about the governance of a new technology? And the answer is really not obvious. And I think what's great about Leah's example is that perhaps the best way to get there is a negotiated co-production of that knowledge, rather than an expert saying, well, if this community is going to weigh in about my gene drive experiment, then they have to know what a gene is, what DNA is, how promoters work, and they could perhaps list a whole scientific course that would require the community to become experts themselves, which, I mean, realistically, that doesn't happen. We can all learn things, we can gain expertise, but we're never going to accomplish the same level of expertise as someone else who's been in that field forever.
Right.
So this issue of what kind of knowledge admits you to the table is a really important one to negotiate in terms of thinking about this landscape of controversy. So I would say just adding interests and the kind of knowledge that is required. And I'll just add one other element to the landscape, which is power differentials. And we need to understand that the kind of historical interactions among different kinds of experts like scientists, and I include social scientists in this, with local communities, indigenous people, people of color. We have problematic histories that we are in the shade of those problematic histories when we do this kind of work. And we can't ignore that when we think about the landscape that we're working on in doing engagement.
Yeah, and I mean, it's such an important point and ties so many of the comments together already today. I mean, I think about this in terms of, we inherit the residues of those historical injustices, and they're often non-obvious or kind of silent, even if they're very, very much alive as dynamics within those communities. They're often silent or not easily accessible for people coming in from the outside. But I want to pick up another implication of your point, Jason, and maybe throw this one to Patricia. And Leah kind of started off talking about this, and Jason, you picked up on it as well, about the purpose of the engagement. We tend to lead with descriptions of the project, maybe about the goals of projects. So I think we struggle with that part of it. But I think Leah described it really nicely about the challenges of trying to explain the purpose of the engagement itself, and what your motivations are, what your own an agenda is, to kind of keep it in sort of controversy terms. So Patricia, I wonder if you could talk, the example you gave about the goat eradication is just a fascinating one. Could you tell us a bit about, how you go about communicating the purpose of your engagement with those other stakeholders who, might hold quite different views?
We started we started communicating the goals of the eradication and how this was going to be done, and grappled with the idea of what do we need to explain to you so you can understand better what the plan is. Instead of saying, let's co-design this, let's sit together, let me tell you about what we're trying to achieve here, which is preventing extinctions in Juan Fernandez archipelago, right? Instead of saying we need to eradicate goats. And then saying, how can we do this together? And what are the benefits that the community gets from this, in addition to conservation? And so when we change the dialogue, when we change the structure of the dialogue, where we're not only this is not a one-way communication where I tell you what the goal is and how you can understand my goal better, and what's the information you need to know about my goal. It was, this is our interest. This is what we would like to do, and that's right, preventing the extinction of all these species. But here is how we can do this together, and let me understand. Let's co-design this. So once it's not difficult. This is difficult, right? Because our approach is usually the most cost efficient, and it's the one that would take less time, and it's really like, in a operational point of view, this is the best way of doing something, because we've done it in 60 other islands, and this is the best way of doing it. But once you say, okay, we will have to change our plan because we can integrate different into our plan, and maybe, yes, that won't be the most cost efficient way of doing it, but we will be able to do it with the help of community and the participation of the community. So once we were basically co-designing the eradication with the community, which meant changing our plans, things started to progress. And it's not only back to the point of how do you engage with others. It's not only the community, but it's also different government agencies that have a responsibility or a management role there, and they're also in a difficult position if you don't have the community on board. So by improving the engagement with the community, the government is also in an easier position to collaborate and work and offer resources for this joint work. So what we, in terms of the how that you were talking about before, when we decided to use the third party facilitator to help, it was, we kind of saw that the dialogue had not reached a level, we were not progressing, right? And we had burnt some bridges. So our team on the ground had burned some bridges with the community already. And we decided to make some changes in that team and incorporate an external third-party facilitator. So there's many different ways that a third-party facilitator can work. And one of them, right, that always comes into the debate is about impartiality. So it needs to be an impartial third-party facilitator. However, if there's power differences, for example, among the different stakeholders, or information differences, or even organizational differences, sometimes I think the third-party facilitator works better if it can, so not be partial, but do some partial work with one of the groups to help it prepare better for the dialogue with the other groups. And oftentimes it's the community that needs this, some extra time with the third-party facilitator to help them organize and identify their interests. The community isn't a community with 5 interests that you need to identify. Usually there's differences of opinion within the community itself on what their interests are. So if you allow some time for the facilitator to work to support the community in fleshing out those interests and reaching internal agreements within the community, it's then easier for you as the conservation agency to engage with a community that has reached some agreements internally. I don't know if, I don't want to extend myself too much on this issue.
No, listen, Patricia, it's terrific, and I really like how you're kind of, getting into more detail about the actual practices and the things that might work. I want to just pick up a couple of points and just a time check. We have about 15 minutes left, so I want to try to get through another round. But one point I wanted to pick up on, in particular, is that back to the purpose of the engagement. One thing that I think is maybe a bit different from your position, say at Island Conservation, is that the mission of your organization is quite clear, and it's a well-known brand, if you like, if you'll kind of tolerate that terminology, and the mission is kind of inherent and reflected in the brand itself. And it's actually not as straightforward in brands, for example, like Target Malaria or World Mosquito Program, where they're kind of newer ideas, and I think there hasn't been an awful lot of time for people to really digest the ultimate goals and purpose. And very, very complex. So, Guilherme, let me toss it over to you. I wonder if you could pick up that point that part of this is about how people come to understand your mission, about what it is that you're trying to do, not just the details of, you described a really great challenge of when you're doing a population replacement, for example, rather than suppression, where you're going to be having to release mosquitoes out. And I wonder if you could just talk about this idea of the challenge of the broader mission, people getting their minds around the broader goals and how they might become part of that, those activities.
Yeah, I think one particular thing that we have done here in Rio is understanding that dengue is a real issue for Brazilians for so long. So Wolbachia method is just a complementary method trying to tackle this issue. So all the engagement was not about making people be convinced about the method that's not working. It's more dialogue with them to explain that to try to solve this big issue for health public, for many consequences that we have because of dengue burnt here. This is a new method. So all the engagement work here was done talking about dengue control, not only the Wolbachia method, all the methodologies, and then explaining the methodology, the new methodology, the innovative methodology. So, and I can't agree more with Leah. Community knows science, can understand science. It's just how we present this to them. And another thing that I was thinking when Jason was talking is that as experts or scientists that are working and presenting something new to the community, we can not be fear that we will find some controversies. We cannot fear the controversy. It's natural. It's if you think that every social group has their own interests and has their own knowledge, it's natural to be different point of views and fears as well. Here in Brazil, we have for so long saying people that mosquitoes are bad. And now I'm saying, yeah, mosquitoes are bad, but I'm also releasing mosquitoes. So it's kind of normal people to be fear of mosquitoes, especially a mosquito that they don't know exactly how this mosquitoes works. So not being fear of the controversy, but trying to understand not only the interests, as Patricia said, because this is a key work of our field work, is understanding the interests, but also trying to listen the fears, how they are worried, and not judging them. I think this is not only an ethical way to work, but also respecting the right of any social groups, not judging them.
Yeah, Yeah, and I think the mosquito context is such an interesting one in the sense, it's the world's most dangerous animal, but for developers, for people working on these technologies for so long, there is a bit of a taken for grantedness about the importance of having these different approaches, and we sometimes forget that the experience of mosquitoes, even in endemic areas, it's still important to kind of get a really good understanding of how people feel about mosquitoes and the way that they interact with them in their daily lives. So I think that came out really, really nicely in your point, Guilherme. Leah, this is something that's really also front and center for you in your work in target malaria. How does that play out for you at your side? The understanding of the relationship between the community and the way they actually look at your technology, the mosquitoes themselves. Like, what have you sort of got any good insights about how people view the technology in a more cultural sense, and how you've approached that? Oh, you're on mute still, Leah.
Okay.
And I should concede that that's probably not the clearest question that's ever been asked in a context like this, but just run with it for me. Yeah.
Okay. I'm saying that at the local level, our community are very curious and about this technology, because we are talking about the modification and the mosquitoes modification. For them, this insect is so small. They want to know how we can modify these mosquitoes. And they have some questions, some concern, they want to know, for instance, we are talking about the sterility of the mosquitoes, what could be happen with the women. There is some link between the sterility of the mosquitoes and the sterility of the women. They have the question, but the important thing that if you listen to the community, and you can bring the answer to the question, they are happy with that. You can also some group who are opposite to this technology, but for us as a team, we work to be inclusive with all of the category of the stakeholders. They have their opinion, sorry, but we work with them to understand their point and take time to explain the research. And the target malaria want to tackle the malaria problem. And here in Burkina, it is a big problem. It is a big health issue. And people can understand that we need to continue the research to come with the complementary tool to fight this disease. And this is the point of view. You have a various point of view, and we work with them.
And Leah, on that point, there's some really terrific questions that are coming up in the chat. By the way, I've been trying to sort of keep track, and one question that's just come up from Raul Medina is, this challenge of when we get into co-production, when we get into trying to authentically privilege the perspectives of the host community people. Sometimes we disagree with their positions, and it's like that old saying, like, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But we also know, as a matter of fact, that some opinions aren't very good, and they can be either bad or good on either side of how the debate's laying out. But it seems to me a really important point, and I think what you're kind of pointing to, and this also came out in some of the other comments, is that these are fundamentally deliberative spaces. There are spaces where the notion of pure agreement is probably not the right place to kind of set the target. No pun intended on the target there, Leah. But and Jason, I know you have done a lot of work and a lot of thinking about deliberative approaches. So I wonder if you could just pick up on that point.
Sure. And I want to engage with some of Raul's questions in the chat too, because they were making me think about, how do we deal with what we might consider confident voices instead of saying extreme voices, but confident voices on either side of a particular issue. And my own experience, for example, I ran a workshop for stakeholders around the genetically engineered American chestnut tree. And this is not a gene drive technology, but it could be a genetically engineered organism that is released into unmanaged environments. In the workshop, we intentionally invited the developers of the tree who are very confident that this is a good technology, that it's safe, and that it will make a positive difference in the environment. And we intentionally invited very confident voices who are sure that this is an evil and misguided effort, that genetic engineering is dangerous to the environment, et cetera. And I think in this situation, this is a really hard problem for engagement. What do we do with these really confident voices? And I think that there's a couple of different possibilities. One is to use a highly facilitated engagement strategy where you're producing a kind of deliberation among the people that are there that is highly facilitated, so that a particular person who's confident doesn't kind of run off the rails and control the agenda. And that's difficult, but it's possible. You can get people to listen to each other, even if you don't get them to agree at the end of the day. And one of the ways to do that is to frame the goal of the deliberation, not simply in terms of, are we going to decide yes or no, is the genetically engineered chestnut a good idea? I would never get that group of people to have a very productive conversation about that ultimate question, but we can ask a different kind of question. And so the one in our workshop was, how do we design broader public engagement around this technology that will inform decision-making about this technology, both in terms of regulatory approval, but also, if it's approved, how it will be monitored and managed in the environment. That's actually a question where you can get people who have very confident voices to have a real conversation about what needs to be done. And I think the other strategy to consider is if engagement is a kind of decision-making, that there's a way to let those confident voices be heard in the process, but perhaps not to be the engagers. So we can imagine creating, a kind of micro-public or a group of stakeholders who are less committed, less confident, to have a deliberative engagement about different kinds of governance or decision-making options, where they hear from these very confident voices and they interact with them and ask them questions. But those people who are already so confident in knowing what they want to do are not part of the discussion of making a decision on behalf of that group. So I just think those are two options to throw out when you're facing this very common situation where you have very confident voices around these controversial technologies.
So, Jason, I think it's just a terrific point. And since we're really up against the hour here, maybe let's kind of end there. I just want a couple of kind of summary points on it, and then that'll give us lots of time then to engage with the questions with some really terrific questions in the chat. Just a couple of points on your comments. I think they come back to power. And we have these different dimensions of power. People don't like to talk about power. It makes everyone uncomfortable wherever you sit in the equation. But especially in this kind of broader conversation in global health that we're all engaged in at the moment about decolonization and looking critically at historical practices that have failed to be inclusive, that have failed to hear perspectives effectively of various stakeholders to privilege perspectives that are probably the ones that might naturally be most confident. So I think the point's really important, and one that we need to reflect deeply on at every level, at funding levels, at program levels. But the second point I want to just flag that I think is so important, and you've each kind of touched on this in your own ways, is that I think these are fundamentally problems of design. And in lots of fields, people pay incredible attention to process design in particular. And I think that we tend not to do that very effectively in science and development strategies. So I think your point and some of the examples that Patricia laid out as well about how do we design these spaces for deliberation in ways that will be able to serve these more robust ethical underpinnings, I think is just terrific. So let's open up to questions. I just really appreciate all of your excellent contributions here, and let's jump in and see what we can do. I'm going to just kind of scroll back up. There are a number, I think, of really good points here. There's so many. Have to kind of come back and start. So one issue is back to a point I raised. This was, I think, Raul Medina's first question. What is your agenda? What is motivating you? What is animating your activity? And I think there is always some concern about the notion that someone is profiting from trying to introduce these technologies, these approaches. So any thoughts about how that kind of shows up in your work? And I think you're all working in nonprofit organizations, but that doesn't mean that the perception isn't there and that the perception isn't driving some of those attitudes. So I wonder if anyone would like to take a stab at that. Yeah, and just jump in. Yeah,
Brazil have just in the very beginning of the engagement, people were saying that we are spreading these mosquitoes to kill the poor and the older people. So this is an idea that we have to deal, because this is a technology made by the government and the rich people of the world to kill the poorest people in Brazil, or the older people. So this is definitely something that's not at all related to, but it's what you said, Jim. Everybody thinks that someone or the organization wants to profit for this. So, right. And again, it's not fearing this. It's just asking why you think about that. In our work, what makes you think that we're trying to kill the poorest and the oldest people and not real facing the issues that we have? So making these questions and listening, starting to be clear what is in the room exactly, what is in the table. So, and then we can deal with the reality. So I think this is something important to consider. And also, you were saying about designing process. One thing that is also, in my perspective, important to know, that is the local political culture, because it's completely different of each one of four of us that is developing engagement works. It's completely different for each one of the countries, not only, but also the local culture as well. So designing process is not just a tool of, oh, you can do this. It's not a manual, a guide. Could be a guide of tools, but without understanding the local culture, and probably will not fit everything that you are intending to develop or design with the community.
Yeah, and the point about so we tend to think about profit in sort of monetary or just strictly commercial terms, but I mean, I think the underlying concern about profit has more to do with sort of unfair practices or exploitation, where you have a really unfair distribution of the benefits that are gained. And I think your point about those can be concerns about political power, or unfairly trying to realize gains in political power. And I think those narratives, the way that they are so powerful. And I think in science we tend to put so much faith and confidence in data and the kind of evidence that we generate, but the data cannot compete with stories. Those narratives are just so incredibly powerful. So it's a great point. All right, let's just kind of keep firing through here, and we'll maybe try to distribute the questions around so that we can keep moving forward. So the next question is from, and I hope I'm pronouncing this properly, but Shaibal Dasgupta, and the question is about, I believe the first thing in engagement is to gauge the knowledge of the community about the problem, and Leah, maybe this one's to you. Do you think you have a shared understanding amongst the communities that you're working with in Burkina about the problems that you're trying to address through the approaches you're developing in target malaria?
Sorry, I'm not sure to catch very well the question, please.
Yeah, so do the communities that you work with, do you think that they understand the problem the same way that the target malaria program does? In other words, this idea of the need for, say, elimination of the Anopheles mosquitoes that are driving malaria transmission. I mean, it's a subtle question, but do they understand the problem in the same way? I mean, we hear so often about people are very tolerant of mosquitoes in endemic areas because it's just been such an integral part of their lives, and they don't necessarily understand why someone would want to try to get rid of all the mosquitoes. So do you think there's a shared understanding of the problem?
Yes. Malaria is a big problem here, and every family have the experiences with this disease, and they can perceive the burden of the malaria. Because of that, working on the malaria project is welcome, I can say, by the community. But we build on top on this by explaining the process of the research. Sometimes people are more confident with the implementation. When you have something to propose now, immediately, they are confident with this. But when you are engaged in the process of the research, it's the long-term activities, and you have the uncertainty in the research process. Meaning by we are working on something, we expect some finding, but maybe we can, at the end, we can have another thing. And because the malaria is the problem, because they understand that we are engaged in the research process, they understand what we are doing. And they expect that we can, at the end, we can have the product that can help to solve the problem of the malaria. That's why I can, yes.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. And sorry, Leah, go ahead.
There is a need for the community.
Right. And so I wonder, Jason, I mean, I know that you have done a lot of thinking about, engaging with indigenous communities, and it seems like there's a kind of parallel there. Do you want to pick up on that?
Sure. So as part of the Chestnut project that I mentioned before, we engaged with the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force, which is a body of indigenous groups in Upper New York State where the chestnut was being developed. And, you know, I think it was important for us to realize very early on, you know, the question of the genetically engineered chestnut wasn't at the top of their agenda. And this connects to Abha's comment later on in the chat. We weren't out to convince them that this should be the highest priority issue for them in terms of what they wanted for their people, their societies, their communities. But what we did was we built a relationship, and this goes back to Jim's point, where we were able to discuss why we were interested in this issue, why we saw an opening for them to be involved in the project and to engage with the scientific team in conversations about this. And we actually redefined a different kind of problem, which they revealed, which was, how do we begin talking about this emerging technology with our historic languages, with our tribal languages? And so in our funded project through the National Science Foundation, not only did we do engagement, but we funded a tribal researcher to do a linguistic analysis to try to understand how could he facilitate a kind of respectful and culturally grounded conversation about this emerging technology for the future. And it didn't feed neatly into exactly what our plans were, but we were able to negotiate this broader framing of the problem to create a kind of reciprocity, which was really important, and that they brought to us in our first conversation, that there needed to be reciprocity in terms of us engaging with them and making sure that some of their interests and needs were met as well. And you know, this problem framing and in collaboration with others, I think is really hard, because you know, oftentimes we go in with really strong and great intentions, and we need to find ways to be a bit humble and to figure out ways where, you know, our interests might align, where we can give a little, where we can be generous and collaborative, and perhaps broaden our framing of the problem to meet some of those needs of the community as well.
Yeah, so that's terrific, Jason. And you know, it also touches on a question that's comes up later from Delphine about you know, whether these engagement strategies are sort of unique or are peculiar to a gene drive or gene drive technologies. And again, we've got some great examples that are outside the gene drive space in today's panel. But it also raises, in my mind, Jason, the idea that, you know, back to this idea that the design of the engagement may be the real key. I mean, it may be that the getting some of those kind of design features that you just described, it may be that that's really what's transferable from technological space to engagement space. And we have tended to be, I think, quite narrow in the way that we conceptualize engagement activity. So I think what you're describing might really be an answer to Delphine's question, that, you know, if the more we take those procedural things and the design things seriously, we might find the more transferable they are. Of course, we also still don't have enough empirical evidence about how these things actually play out. So that's an important piece as well. And let me riff on that point and pick up a question from Tony Nolan, which is, you know, something I think that we've all grappled with a bit is, who gets to decide whether engagement has been done well? And of course, that's an incredibly complex and difficult sort of social and political question as well. But Patricia, I'm going to land that on you, even though it's a really hard one. You can blame Tony for the hard question. But you know, how do you think about that in the context of your work, the evaluative side of this? How do you yourself think about how well you've done on the engagement, and how do you incorporate those other kind of evaluative perspectives from other stakeholders?
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Tony, for the difficult question. I think we all ponder.
You can always rely on Tony, you know.
I'm gonna stop my video just in case the connection isn't good enough. And so thanks again, Tony. I think it obviously it depends, right? But in the sort of, I think a general measure of a successful engagement is if you've been able to, through this engagement, build a relationship with the parties in that were involved in the process. So if you're working in my area in conservation, we're gonna need to work with this community at least in the midterm or long term to make sure that the eradication results hold. And then we usually reintroduce other species that have been that are locally extinct, but that you can find elsewhere. We can reintroduce them. So for us, in our example, I think we're successful if we're able to build a good collaborative relationship with the stakeholders as a result of that engagement. So we can work together in the midterm or long term with them, likewise with the government. If we're able to work with the different government agencies in the where the project was held and other places, that also to us is a signal of a good process. And so sometimes I think the easy thing is to think, oh, if we reach agreement, then it's successful, right? But agreement isn't always a signal of success, because the relationship is often really more important, and how you get to that agreement is more important really than the agreement itself, because then you need to implement agreement. And if you haven't worked on improving the relationship in the process, then implementation is going to be hard. I don't know, that I'm trying to be brief in an answer to a difficult question.
Patricia, that was I think a very elegant response to Tony's hard question. And not only that, I think it flows, I think really nicely for me into Todd Kukin's question as well, which is fundamentally about the role of government. We tend to not talk a lot about government. We tend to forget that some sovereign governments actually have legislative mandates to deal with some of these issues. But I think your points, Patricia, kind of flow directly into that. And Guilherme, you also work in public policy and public engagement, and I wonder from your perspective, how do you think about this balance between the or how do you think about the actual roles of the engagement activities with respect to broader policy decisions that governments ought to make? And there's been an awful lot of controversy, for example, about direct democracy, about just doing everything in a referendum and abrogating responsibilities of government to make decisions on behalf of their population. So how do you reconcile those two things in your work?
Yeah, I think especially in Brazil, where we have a constitution that stimulates the people to participate in the policies, because we have the councils for each public policies, environmental ones, healthy ones. So in this kind of governments that we are trying, even if in this moment is not exactly the way the government is running this, but the constitution that at least are investing people to the power to participate. So in the World Mosquito Program, we are considering this because the health system, public system here in Brazil, asks people to participate in the policy, the health policies, and arbovirus control is one of them. So all of the time, all the communications channels, the engagement work that we are doing is to open channels for people to participate, but also to bring the government agencies and institutions to participate as well. So when we go to the field work, we are not engaging only with the community. We are also engaged with the health agents, the health units, the public schools, the social service agencies. So, and this is challenging. And one, we are talking about engagement indicators. One of our indicators in some territories is how we could make the different policies talk between each other. Sometimes the health clinic just don't talk with the public school in the same neighborhood. They do different works completely. So we try to work in the territory, make all these agencies together, and with the residents association, with other NGOs in the territory. So this is for us, at least in Rio, as one indicator of success of engagement, when we could put all these different social groups and actors together to think the territory. And so, considering the policies, the public policies.
Yeah. So Guilherme, let me stay with you for a second, because deeper in the chat, and I apologize, I'm doing my best to kind of keep them in order, but I'm also trying to weave them in here. So this is, a really important question, I think, from Sarah Hartley that picks up exactly on this point, and it's really about the purpose of those engagement with that other set of stakeholders, which are the policymakers, and how do you view the goals of that set of engagements then? Is it about trying to help them shape a decision? Is it about trying to lay out a kind of policy pathway? How do you conceptualize that engagement with those policymakers who may have that mandate, as you said, to enact legislation or policy or introduce these technologies in a broader public health context?
Yeah, I think for our experience here, it comes to the arbovirosis control program. So we cannot be very far from that, because where we are, the policy that we are directly related to, but we also has different policies that we are related, like the science education program for schools and other ones. So when we bring all these different stakeholders together and into the same discussion or the same room to discuss these things, is also understanding that these discussions will help them to improve their work or developing better policies or making the policy to be implemented, because they can be written but not developed. So I remember another example here in Rio, the former Secretary of Education. He has in the law that each school has to have a science teacher and develop some work, and he cannot do this in more than 400 schools. So using the method and all the meetings that we are doing in the territory, he used this to improve this work with the science teachers. So this is kind of a work that when we are doing a territory-based engagement work, these outcomes will appear as well. Not only the implementation of the method, the Vomake method, because this is a small part of all what's happening in the territory, but for these other policies could have a good outcome as well. I'm not clear if I answered your question.
I mean, again, they're difficult questions, which is exactly what we're looking for. What I like about your answer is that, I mean, it really highlights that we're never simply introducing a technology. We're introducing, complex ways of trying to think about and address complex problems. So I thought that came through really nicely there, Guilherme. Okay, so look, we have, I think, about 8 minutes left. So I want to see if we can get at least 3 more questions in. And again, I'm jumping a little. Please accept our apologies, anyone who has a question that we don't address it directly. We're trying to sort of thread them together the best we can. Leah, this one to you from Adam Perez, which I think you touched on a bit at the start, but I actually like the framing, where he's asking, should we only start engagement efforts once we have some preliminary results to support the proposed technology? And it's actually, I think, quite a sophisticated question. The answer is, we all say the answer is start early, but we rarely actually unpack what it means to start early. And I know we've had this conversation ourselves many times, Leah, I wonder if you kind of give some thoughts about what that, because what it meant for you guys with Target Malaria to have to try to start those conversations, before all the final technological issues were sorted out.
In terms of our experiences, when we talk about the success of the engagement, we, as a team, we do some internal audit to know what people think about our activity, about our engagement, and how we can take into account their advice to improve our dialogue. And for us, that is the great thing, to listen to people and to take the thought to improve our interaction in the development of this technology. I don't want to be.
No, but I think again it picks up on the point that I just made with Guilherme, that it's never just about the technology. It's about this idea of trying to cultivate relationships and introduce these different ideas in ways that aren't just kind of interventionist in the more stark ways that we're used to in the history in global health. So that's terrific. So again, just the clock's winding down. I want to see if we can get through as many of these as possible. Jason, I'm going to throw this one to you from Scott Shore. And again, it's a hard and important kind of broad question, I think, about the way these activities sit in a broader context of global governance, and the just how unclear often the kinds of accountabilities are, and the kinds of authorities that sit in this kind of broad global governance space. So any general thoughts in response to Scott?
Sure. I think, one comment is that engagement is not a panacea. It doesn't solve all the problems, and we are operating in a complex political environment. I mean, regulatory decisions about new technologies are political decisions, and they can be informed by engagement, but there are these political processes that are going on. And as Guilherme said, to some degree, they may engage broader publics as well, although to varying degrees of success, often not very successful. But the work that we do is in that context. So that's the first thing I would say. I would also say that there's really ways to think about engagement in different phases of technology development. And this addresses the question of how early is too early that Leo was talking about as well. It may not be appropriate to go to a community and say, we don't have this technology yet, we're just thinking about it, what do you think? Right? That may not be very productive. But at that same phase, you might be able to assemble a group of stakeholders with very diverse expertise to have a conversation about what kinds of design features do you need to think about for the technology, what sort of safety testing and proof of concept would be meaningful to that broad stakeholder community, and even what sort of areas you would need to engage in the future. So there's engagement can contribute to different phases of decision making. It's not all about that regulatory approval moment, which we tend to get fixated on. There's the research and development phase, and there's also the phase after regulatory approval that I've called deployment, management, and monitoring, where there's a lot of decisions to be made about how we govern and manage a technology as it's released into the environment and used for the first times, where public engagement or stakeholder engagement can really matter and contribute. So I think there's broader ways to think about engagement so that we don't get trapped into this narrow question of, well, is it too early to talk to a community member about a complex technology that we don't have in final form and all the testing data? That's probably not the best question to ask.
Excellent. So, as painful as it is, I think we're going to have to leave it there. I've just really, really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much, panelists, for just an incredible wealth of insights and thoughtful examples about your work, and to incredible questions from the chat and great responses from the panelists. And I'm going to hand it over now to Karen, and who will kind of just frame, I think, next steps in the series. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jim. And thank you very much to Patricia, Leah, Guilherme, and Jason for sharing your experiences and for providing a very thought-provoking discussion today. And I also want to thank the participants who joined the call today for really asking some very hard questions of our panelists. I don't think we got to all of them, but we got to some really good ones. So thank you again. The next session in this series is going to be held on March 9th, and it will focus on stakeholder engagement and risk assessment. The discussion will be moderated by Dr. Sujatha Raman from the Australian National University. And we look forward to another rousing discussion and hope everyone can join us. So thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.